What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
They told me there wasn't a single dollar for my education, and I believed them, because why would your own parents look you in the eye and lie about something that would shape the rest of your life? I remember the conversation like it's carved into my skin. My acceptance letter to a state university was still warm from the envelope, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a heart that felt too big for my chest. I was ready to cry from excitement, ready to hear at least a sliver of pride from them. Instead, my father leaned back in his chair and muttered, almost like it bored him, that college was a luxury for girls who didn't know what else to do with their time. My mother didn't even flinch. She just kept stirring the sauce on the stove and said, almost cheerfully, that maybe I should look into community college, or better yet, save the money and get a real job. At first, I laughed because I thought it was some kind of cruel joke. But then the words kept coming, sharper each time. They said education was an investment and investments had to make sense, and they didn't see the point of wasting thousands on me when I'd just end up married anyway. Those were my mother's exact words, spoken like she was offering me some kind of wisdom. And I sat there with my letter in my hands, the words congratulations staring up at me like a punchline I was too slow to catch. I tried to fight it. I said I could take out loans, that even a small contribution would help me feel supported, that I wasn't asking them to hand me everything, just to believe in me enough to stand beside me. My father snapped that loans were a trap, and if I was foolish enough to dig that hole, I could fall into it alone. Then he added that I'd regret it when I had nothing but debt and no man willing to marry me. I didn't realize I'd started crying until my brother, Matt, walked in, grinning like the golden child he always was, waving his own letter from a prestigious law school. That moment split me in half. My acceptance letter was already wilting from my tears, while Matt's was treated like scripture. My parents jumped up to hug him, my father clapped him on the back, my mother kissed his cheek, and before I could even breathe, they were talking numbers. Tuition, housing, books, the whole 9 yards. There was no hesitation, no talk about education being a luxury, no mention of debt traps. They were ready, instantly, to write checks, co-sign loans, move heaven and earth for him. I sat there at the same table, the same daughter, with the same dreams, and I might as well have been invisible. That night, I couldn't eat. The smell of spaghetti sauce clung to my hair as I shut myself in my room, staring at the acceptance letter I had been so proud of just hours earlier. My phone buzzed with texts from friends congratulating me, asking about dorms, about majors, about the future. I didn't know how to answer, because by then I already understood there was no future for me, not the one I had dreamed of. My future had just been rewritten in front of me, signed away with a smirk and a shrug. I heard them laughing in the kitchen later, talking about how Matt was the future of this family, how he was going to bring honor and stability, how they would make sure he had every advantage. My mother even said it was a good thing I was practical, because I wouldn't make a fuss about my own path. Practical. That was their word for me. Not ambitious, not talented, not worth the same sacrifice. Just practical. The following week, I got the rejection letter in the mail, not from the university, but from life itself, because I had to decline my admission. I did it quietly, without telling my friends, without telling my teachers who had written glowing recommendations for me. I folded the paper up and stuffed it in a drawer like it was evidence of a crime. And maybe it was, because when I came out to the kitchen that same day, my father was proudly hanging Matt's law school acceptance letter on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a smiley face. The sight of it nearly broke me in two. In that moment, I realized something important. They weren't broke. They weren't stretched thin. They weren't saving every penny. They had money, plenty of it, just not for me. I was never going to be their investment, never going to be the child they bet on. And the sting of that truth was sharper than any insult they had ever thrown at me. I sat in my room that night and swore to myself that I would never forget this day, never forgive the way they had made me feel disposable. I didn't know how yet, but I promised myself that one day I would find a way to make them regret underestimating me. And as I listened to them clinking glasses in the kitchen, celebrating Matt's future like it was theirs, I smiled bitterly through the tears and whispered into the silence of my room, one day, this family will wish they had invested in me. The first months after I folded that admission letter into a quiet grave inside my desk felt like standing in an empty train station after the last departure. Yet I forced myself to keep moving because if I stopped even for a breath, the grief would pour in like floodwater. So I took a cashier job that paid in coins and apologies. I took a late shift at a cafe where the espresso machine screamed like a temperamental violin. And I learned the rhythm of exhaustion that leaves your shoes sticky, with milk foam and your hair smelling like fryer oil, while I counted tips at midnight and told myself that a life built without applause is still a life that stands. I rented a room in a faded house that had once been cheerful and now sagged like a parent who stopped lifting their own head, with walls the color of tea left too long, with a bathroom that insisted on hissing each time the water turned hot, and with roommates who wrote their names on yogurt lids as if property rights began with dairy. And in that crowded quiet, I discovered that a person can become oddly proud of the discipline it takes to live with rice, beans, and stubbornness, because pride is cheap when love is rationed. At the cafe, a woman with a blazer that cost more than my rent tipped me with a card that wasn't money but a door, a tiny white rectangle from a tech startup in the neighborhood that needed someone who could keep a schedule, keep a temper, and keep the coffee from tasting like regret. And although I knew nothing about venture capital or user growth or why anyone would call a dashboard beautiful, I knew how to show up early, write everything down, and learn before I asked to be noticed. So I said yes and moved from the whine of the espresso machine to the hum of a glass office, where the plants somehow never died and the founders wore sneakers that whispered privilege. I sat near the entrance, an assistant with a notebook and a headset, and quietly absorbed a new language shaped by words like runway and burn rate and churn, and I watched meetings where people drew boxes on a whiteboard and treated those boxes like destinies. And I started keeping a second notebook that wasn't for tasks, but for patterns, because I realized the company itself was a story that repeated. Person identifies a pain, person offers a fix, person convinces the room that the fix, not the pain, is the future. And once I recognized that rhythm, I began to apply it to my own life, which meant every day I asked myself not why did they do this to me, but what system am I building so they never do it again. Paychecks arrived that looked like paragraphs instead of fragments, and I bought a used sedan with a stubborn engine that coughed each morning and still felt like independence. And on Fridays I drove past my parents' street without turning because I could not trust my face to stay calm if I saw the law school decals on my brother's bumper, yet I still answered their texts. The practical daughter who delivered photos of thrift store finds and cheerful updates about staying busy, while my mother sent pictures of Matt in suits that fit like promises and captions that read, "He is going to make us so proud," as if pride were a savings account you can only open in a son's name. I kept collecting small humiliations like bottle caps, the kind that seem light until you have a pocketful. At a Sunday dinner, my father asked if the cafe still gave me staff discounts even though I had already told them about the new job. My brother performed a little speech about how some people thrive in academic rigor, and some people thrive doing, whatever they do, and he said it with that benevolent cruelty that passes as warmth in families where fairness is theater, and I smiled. Because smiling is cheaper than setting the table on fire, though the idea had a certain crisp appeal. Revenge, when it finally visited, did not arrive as a scream or a slammed door, but as a decision to spend my money on meaning rather than on making them feel comfortable. So when the cafe asked me to help staff a charity gala hosted at the hotel downtown, an event my parents adored because it made them feel almost important in a room full of people pretending they already were, I agreed to volunteer an evening and a portion of my paycheck, and I asked the organizer if donations could be read aloud with dedications, and the organizer said absolutely, because names are how events like this actually breathe. Near the end of the night, after the speeches about opportunity and the photos of donors in borrowed light, the MC announced a final contribution to a local scholarship fund for first-generation college students. A tidy sum that I had scraped together from double shifts and quiet frugality, and the dedication, which I had written with a hand that shook only once, asked that the award go to a young woman told there is no money for her education. And when those words rolled across the Carpeted room like a soft thunder, I watched my mother's smile curdle into confusion and my father's hand tighten around his glass as if water could argue with truth. While I simply adjusted my volunteer badge and kept moving trays as if nothing unusual had happened, because revenge is most elegant when it looks like service. A woman in a navy dress approached me afterward, not because she recognized me, but because she recognized the feeling behind the dedication. And she pressed a business card into my palm and said that her company needed someone who could keep chaos orderly and tell the truth without flinching, and I should call her on Monday because she had a project that might fit. And I smiled with the kind of gratitude that comes from watching a door open in a wall you were told would never move, while across the ballroom, my mother stared at the stage as if the microphone might apologize. When I stepped outside into the thick night air, my phone lit up with my brother's name and a message that read, "Call me now, it's urgent." And I stood there on the hotel steps thinking that perhaps the story had decided to turn, though I could not yet see whether it was toward mercy or toward something with sharper teeth. When I stepped out into the hotel's heavy night and the city smelled like wet linen and car exhaust, my phone kept pulsing with my brother's name until I answered, and his voice, so usually lacquered with confidence, came through raw and scratchy as he told me that the bar exam had shrugged him off like a coat that didn't fit, that he had missed the mark by a handful of cruel points, and that he needed a second round of prep courses, tutoring, and time, which in our family had always translated to me being asked to behave like an extra wallet with a polite smile, so I listened without interrupting, because I have learned that silence, when used precisely, can make a person show you who they are faster than any argument. He said the words I had been waiting to hear since the first tuition conversation flattened me years earlier, that Mom and Dad were tapped out and stressed and holding the line, that they had carried him as far as they could, and now he needed everyone to pitch in for the final push, and right there beneath the hotel awning I could almost see the scene at their dining table, the sympathetic head tilt from my mother, the managerial clap from my father, the unspoken asterisk that family means sacrifice unless the daughter is the one with dreams. I told him we would talk on Sunday at dinner, and I hung up before he could thank me for a promise I had not made. On Sunday, I drove to the house I used to call home and noticed that the lawn had the two neat stripes of hired care while the mailbox leaned like a tired friend, and inside the kitchen the fridge was still a shrine to my brother's progress, now decorated with a schedule labeled Bar Study Redemption and a list of purchases that read like a small war budget, and my mother, wearing the perfume she reserves for the performances we call family, announced that they had found a discounted prep package if we acted quickly, then slid a printout toward me as if I were a compliance department rather than a daughter who had once folded her own future into a drawer. I let my father deliver the sermon about how families close ranks when one of us stumbles, how this was temporary, how I had a good job now and no children and no mortgage, so surely I could float the cost while my brother carried the torch. And the language he chose felt almost liturgical, as if sacrifice only counted when it came from me, so I let him finish, and then reached into my tote for the small framed rectangle I had brought, a joke in the shape of a document, a mock check, printed on thick paper with my name on the account and the payee listed as Family Investment Equalization Fund, the amount written cleanly as $0.00, and in the memo line, in tidy ink, the phrase, "Matching parental contribution toward my college education," which I slid across the table with a smile that tasted like steel. My mother's mouth made a tiny pink O of shock that would have been funny if it hadn't been a museum of every year I spent pretending their choices didn't cut bone, and my father, trying to recover the upper hand, said this wasn't helpful and that sarcasm never built a family, and I replied, in the gentlest voice I own, that I had also brought solutions, because I am the kind of woman who arrives with options even when respect does not. And I told my brother that the general counsel at my company had arranged a slot for him to audit a pro bono bar prep cohort that pairs borderline retakers with volunteer attorneys on the condition that each participant commit a set number of hours to the tenants' rights clinic downtown, which would cost him only time and humility. He said he didn't want charity, that he needed the premium course everyone uses, and I nodded as if I hadn't expected that answer all along. Since we were speaking in the currency of fairness, I added a second option, that I would match, down to the penny, any amount my parents had put toward my education, payable immediately and without interest, and that amount, as memorialized by the framed check now lying between the salt and the pepper like a thin blade, was precisely nothing, which made my brother's eyes flash with that old mix of entitlement and shame, and made my mother reach for a glass of water she didn't drink, and made my father say that this was a petty grudge that would poison my future because money comes and goes, but blood is permanent. To which I replied that the permanence of blood had never paid an invoice and that I had decided a long time ago to stop underwriting other people's choices while being told my own were indulgences. Revenge, that evening, was not the laugh I swallowed or the check I refused to write. It was the call I had made the night before to the scholarship committee from the gala, asking whether the new award could be assigned early if a candidate met the criteria quickly. And then quietly nominating a bar retaker named Tasha who brewed coffee beside me in the old cafe and studied on her breaks with the kind of stubborn brightness I recognized in my own mirror, and when my phone buzzed during dessert, with a message confirming her acceptance and her stipend, I felt a clean current run through me, the feeling of directing the river rather than drowning in it, and I tucked the phone away, stood, and told my brother that when he was ready to earn rather than receive, I would introduce him to the clinic director who would gladly trade his hours for the mentorship he claimed he could not afford. I left the framed check on their table like a tiny sculpture of memory and walked to the door while my mother asked me not to do anything I couldn't take back, and my father muttered that I had no idea what they had given up for us. And I paused just long enough to say that someday I might have the full picture and that I would be ready for it. Then in the driveway my phone rang again, this time not my brother, not the gala contact, but a number with the county's prefix and a careful voice. Asked if I could come by the clerk's records office in the courthouse basement on Monday morning regarding a matter that might involve my name and a signature from years ago. A signature on an education-related document I would probably want to see with my own eyes. By the time the fourth year rolled around, I had built a life so solid that even the trembling voices of my parents calling for minor contributions felt like the scratching of a pen on an empty page, inconsequential yet insistent. And I had learned to answer with calm precision rather than frustration, because I understood that power is measured not in raised voices, but in the quiet capacity to say no when everyone expects you to comply, and the more they asked, the clearer the boundaries became in my mind, lines drawn with a confidence that came from having paid for my own ambitions and having turned every penny into proof of my independence. Matt, despite all the resources thrown at him, was barely maintaining his first position at a local law firm, the kind where junior associates are given tasks designed to crush morale and measure resilience. And yet the family still treated him like a golden boy whose every stumble could be corrected with a check, while I, who had endured years of deferred gratification, long hours, and careful navigation of spaces where no one noticed me unless I made noise, was expected to consider supporting their comfort, a ridiculous expectation that I had grown accustomed to declining with increasing certainty, which meant that each conversation with them became a negotiation in which my refusal was not only deliberate but morally anchored. The day they called to ask for help with what they insisted was a family emergency fund was the moment I realized how far I had come, because the request was couched in every familiar manipulation, sighs of exhaustion, veiled guilt, reminders of shared history, subtle hints that without my contribution the family might crumble, and yet, as I sat in my apartment overlooking the city lights that glimmered like possibilities, I recognized their pattern as clearly as the lines on a map. And I decided that the path forward required clarity rather than compromise, a decision that would mark the turning point between being the obedient child and being the architect of my own justice. I explained to them, in the most patient tone I could summon, that I would not be contributing to any fund, that my education, my efforts, my financial independence were not a reservoir from which others could draw at whim, and that any future requests for support would be met with the same measured answer, because the foundation of my life had been built without their assistance, and the boundaries I now maintained were the structure upon which my dignity rested, and I watched, through the crack of the phone, as shock and disbelief rippled through the voices on the other end, a combination of incredulity and the faintest hint of panic. The first evidence that they had underestimated the resolve that had quietly grown over years of patient strategy. When my brother called a few hours later, pleading that I at least help with a minor expense, I did not hesitate, and I presented him with an offer that was both generous and carefully designed to illuminate his dependence. He could access guidance and mentorship from a network I had cultivated over the years, a series of professional introductions and coaching sessions, but only if he acknowledged the fact that the family funds had been allocated entirely for him in the past, and that I had chosen to step away from any further participation, which forced him to confront the truth he had long avoided. That my success had been self-earned and that my refusal was not punishment, but a reflection of my commitment to principles that extended beyond mere family loyalty. I remember the silence on the other end of the line, that pregnant pause in which he digested the terms, and how, at the same moment, I felt the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming agency, of watching the unspoken power dynamics shift so subtly that no one else in the house would notice unless they were paying attention to the fine details. And I realized that revenge does not always arrive as a dramatic gesture, but often as the accumulation of thoughtful decisions that make those who once underestimated you reconsider their assumptions, even as they retain the illusion of control. That evening, as I walked past the kitchen where the framed photographs of Matt's graduations, awards, and ceremonial smiles hung like evidence of favoritism, I paused for a moment and considered the arc of the years that had brought me here, the sleepless nights, the shifts that left me physically drained yet mentally sharp, and I understood that my actions, quiet and deliberate, had already exacted a measure of justice, the kind that cannot be quantified in dollars, but can be felt in the tightening of their expectations, the recalibration of their assumptions, and the emergence of a woman who had transformed perceived scarcity into unassailable autonomy, leaving no doubt that I was no longer available for exploitation. By the time I returned to my apartment, the city lights reflecting against the windows like distant witnesses, I allowed myself a moment of reflection, knowing that I had built more than a career or a life. I had constructed a framework for interaction that demanded respect, required acknowledgement of my choices, and delivered, in its subtlety, a kind of revenge so complete that it would echo for years, shaping how every conversation, every request, every expectation from that family would be met, with a refusal that carried the weight of experience, wisdom, and unshakable resolve. Years passed with a rhythm that seemed both familiar and alien, as if time itself had taken a slow, deliberate walk around the family I once depended on and left me standing outside, observing, calculating, and quietly thriving. And I realized that the silence I had maintained was more powerful than any argument, more permanent than any check, and more revealing than any confrontation could have been, because the absence of my compliance forced every expectation, every entitlement, and every assumption into the open, allowing the truth of who I had become to speak louder than the words they still attempted to manipulate me with. My parents reached out occasionally, their calls measured and hesitant, often beginning with the softest inquiries about my health or career, but quickly veering into requests thinly disguised as family concern, invitations that carried the weight of obligation, and subtle reminders of years in which they had claimed authority over my life, and each time I listened, measured, and responded with the calm precision that had become my trademark, never missing an opportunity to reaffirm that the past could not be rewritten, that my contributions would remain exclusively my choice, and that the autonomy I had fought to establish was now untouchable, forming a quiet fortress around every decision, every relationship, and every investment I chose to make in the life I had built without them. My brother, Matt, eventually called with the sort of desperation that comes from realizing that privilege, no matter how lavishly granted, cannot substitute for personal responsibility, and he spoke of mounting debt, of a position that offered little advancement, and of a future that suddenly seemed narrower than it had been when checks were written on demand, and I listened to him recount the pressures I had once escaped, the obligations I had never allowed to dictate my trajectory, and I offered guidance, professional connections, and mentorship, but always within the strict boundaries I had defined, so that he could feel both the benefit of my experience and the consequences of his own choices, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that success built on favors is fragile, whereas the life earned through endurance and strategy is resilient beyond expectation. There were moments, of course, when my parents attempted to evoke guilt, reminding me of shared childhood memories, vacations, birthdays, and sacrifices they claimed were made on my behalf, and I considered them carefully, weighing each assertion not as an emotional lever but as data to be understood in context, and I replied with empathy that recognized history but refused to be coerced, explaining that respect, recognition, and cooperation were earned through actions that reflected fairness and mutual investment, not demanded through expectation, entitlement, or the emotional weight of nostalgia, which in their hands had always been a tool for control. I found a quiet satisfaction in this calculated distance, in knowing that I had transformed years of marginalization into a network of influence, confidence, and autonomy, and that every call, every plea, and every subtle manipulation was met with the knowledge that I was now in control of my participation, my generosity, and the direction of my life, and in that control there was a form of revenge that needed no spectacle, because the mere fact of my success, independence, and deliberate choice not to participate in their preferential system conveyed more truth than any confrontation ever could. Even as I reflected on these years, I could not ignore the lingering tension, the hollow spaces left by estrangement, the ambiguous emotional cost of refusing to be complicit in a system that had once defined me as disposable. And I recognized that the ultimate revenge I had enacted was not financial or performative, but existential, by living fully, with agency, and by refusing to provide for them the validation they once sought through my compliance. I had rewritten the narrative of my life in a manner that was inescapable, undeniable, and permanent, leaving them to reckon with the consequences of choices they had made years earlier. The final moments of confrontation, if they could be called that, occurred silently, through absence rather than argument, through the quiet knowledge that I had built a life that no longer required their intervention or approval. And as I stood on the balcony of my apartment overlooking the city that had become both stage and witness to my achievements, I allowed myself the recognition that my decisions, however difficult, had created a space in which I was both safe and untouchable, that the silence I maintained was a louder testament than any words, and that the family who once dictated the terms of my worth would now encounter only the reality that I had become the architect of my own destiny, leaving a resonance of unresolved tension that would echo in their minds far longer than any argument, any check, or any plea could ever have done. And as the night deepened and the city lights reflected like distant promises, I understood, with a clarity born of years of careful strategy, that revenge is most complete not in spectacle, but in the quiet, unwavering assertion of one's autonomy, a truth that they would feel for the rest of their lives, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not.